welcome to this video where I will be discussing the conflict resolution spectrum for the 21st century that you see on your screen here. This conflict resolution spectrum is produced by the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation. So you'll see the company logo on the top left corner there. And basically the conflict resolution spectrum has a number of major, but not all of them, conflict resolution tools listed. So you see dialogue, coaching, negotiation, facilitation, and so on, listed on a line from left to right. And on the right side of the line, or the right side of the spectrum, we see that it's formal and mandatory. On the left side, it's informal and voluntary. So that's the measure, if you will. We're plotting out these tools onto this line as being either more formal and mandatory or less formal and more voluntary on the left side. And then underneath each of these tools, we also have some features of online and distance dispute resolution. So we'll talk about that in a moment. First of all, though, let me introduce the different tools that are listed here. So we'll start on the very far right. So we see adjudication, which is sometimes also listed as litigation. In other words, what we're talking about is the formal legal process is one way to resolve conflicts. I think that's pretty clear to people. If there's a conflict between a company and an individual, and they sue, the individual sues the company, that gets resolved, that conflict gets resolved through adjudication, through the legal system. So it's formal and it's mandatory in the sense that, if you're called to court, you have to be there, and there are written records of everything taken, and there are well-established rules and procedures and precedents, and so it's a very formal way of resolving the conflict. There are, people who are professional lawyers and so on and so forth. And it's mandatory also in the sense that, if you are, because of that process, that litigation process, if you're ruled to pay damages, an X number of thousands of dollars, or to resolve that conflict, if it's ruled that, you have to go to jail, you don't really have any say in the matter. And it's mandatory that you do what the judge tells you to do. Okay, so that's litigation. That's one of the most formal and mandatory methods of resolving conflicts. To the left of that is arbitration. There are people that are professional arbitrators. There are training programs for arbitrators. There are standards, certifying bodies for arbitrators. So there's an organization, of course, called ABR Canada, that they certify arbitrators as well as mediators. And so in arbitration, a neutral, outside, third-party arbitrator listens to both sides of the story and then makes a decision. And so it's very similar to the role of a judge, but it's outside of the court system, so it's a little less formal. Some arbitration decisions are binding. In other words, whatever the arbitrator decides as the outcome, you have to follow it. So in that sense, it's somewhat mandatory. And there is also a form of arbitration that's non-binding, where the arbitrator can make a ruling, decide upon the outcome, and it's up to the parties to actually go ahead and do that or not. So it's not necessarily a binding outcome that they're forced to follow. Okay. Next to that is investigation, and so this is very much within a workplace setting. If there are two co-workers that are in a conflict with one another, and they've maybe made allegations of sexual harassment at work, You can have an outside investigator come in, interview the parties, interview their co-workers, maybe interview their supervisors, conduct research on, what is the organization's sexual harassment policy. And so they conduct a formal workplace investigation. To the left of that, we have mediation. Mediation is when a outside third party brings together two parties who are in conflict, and the mediator assists the parties with their talks. They might structure the process of the talks, and it's a little less formal and it's a little less mandatory in that there's a mediation process, but there are lots of variations to it, and different mediators will adjust the process or maybe have their own version of the process or follow a different process for each case. So whereas say litigation is very structured and formal in the sense that the judge there are everything is very structured, mediation is a little less so. Okay, and then to the left of that, and then so a mediator also can't or shouldn't, according to some literature, shouldn't suggest a solution for the parties, and they're simply there to help facilitate the conversation between them, and they might bring some structure to the dialogue, but whatever the outcome is in mediation, it's not always binding, and it can be up to the parties to implement it. So facilitation is somewhat similar to mediation. It's a little less formal and mandatory in the sense that a facilitator can guide a conversation amongst a group of people who are in a conflict, or amongst two people who are in a conflict. That's again an outside third-party role. To the left of that, we've got negotiation, and that's basically when there's a conflict or dispute or a problem to sort out. The two parties meet, most likely face-to-face, but it can also occur virtually through email, as we'll talk about in a moment. But the two parties meet and try to hash out their problem, and this is further left on the spectrum in the sense that there's a step-by-step formal negotiation process that exists in the literature, but different negotiators don't always follow that process. Negotiation can be very informal in the sense that it could occur in a cafe, and there would be no written records, there would be no public witnesses per se, to observe the signing of the agreement. And so negotiation can be very unstructured and almost become a wandering dialogue, which is actually on the furthest left. So next, after negotiation, we've got coaching. Coaching is essentially where, let's say there are two parties that are in a negotiation, and one feels stuck. Another word might be consulting, I suppose. And they realize, well, we're not good negotiators, or we can't get our message across clearly, or we don't understand what the conflict is about. So there's a whole bunch of conflict coaching activities and services. So on our website, ciian.org, we actually have a page where we list a number of those. And so the support coaching is basically providing support to one of the parties in the conflict. And there is conflict coaching. There are people who specialize in conflict coaching, and that's all they do. Just like there are some people that specialize in mediation, and that's all they do. So there's a whole kind of sub-field, I would say, around coaching. And then on the furthest left, at the most informal and voluntary it can get is dialogue. Why is it voluntary? Well, you could imagine if you had a problem with your neighbor, maybe over a fence, and you want to try to sort that out through dialogue. Well, it's voluntary in that you could ask that person to come and sit down and have a tea with you and chat, but they don't have to if they don't want to deal with the issue, if they don't have time. They don't have to participate in the dialogue. It's completely voluntary for them to show up and to participate. It's informal in the sense that a dialogue can occur pretty much with zero structure. I mean, if you invited your neighbor over for a tea, it's informal setting, and that the dialogue is occurring in your living room. It's informal in that there's no outside witnesses, there's no written records, there's no video recording of what's happening. It's informal in the sense that if the two of you reach a deal about that fence, there's no laws that apply necessarily. It's just a solution that you worked out with your neighbor. So and there's no structure to the dialogue. Like, there's no step-by-step process to guide the whole dialogue session, and so the chances are that the dialogue could again meander and go way off topic. Okay, so those are the different, or a number of predominant conflict resolution tools and methods plotted onto this chart, and hopefully you can see the difference if we go to the far ends of the spectrum, say adjudication or litigation. Hopefully you can see how that is very, very formal and mandatory, as I've already explained. And then the polar opposite of that, on the far left side of the chart, at the very most informal and most voluntary level, is having a dialogue. And then somewhere in between there is all this other stuff, like investigations and negotiation. So what we've done with this chart then, underneath it, on the left side, as you can see, we have email, phone, Skype, live chat, online forums, Twitter, and webinars. And what we've tried to do is visually depict, and this is why it's called the spectrum for the 21st century. The original spectrum, if you see it in other textbooks, won't have all of these modern communication methods listed on the diagram. And so what we're trying to depict is that some of these methods can be done through email and phone and so on and so forth. So we can see then with emails that you can have a dialogue. And that bar extends all the way through to investigations. But you're not going to have an arbitration happen through email, and the litigation or adjudication and the court process does not happen through email. But it would not be uncommon to have a dialogue. Let's go back to the example that I gave earlier for dialogue about two neighbors fighting over a fence. Instead of having the dialogue where they come into someone's living room and have a tea and talk about the fence, it's perfectly conceivable that whole dialogue or that whole conversation could go back and forth through a series of emails. And so, you could imagine what those emails might look like, where, Bill would send an email to John saying, your fence, I believe it's on my side of the property, what can you do about this? And then the other fellow might write back saying, oh, I didn't know that, and, why don't we split the charges, the cost of getting a surveyor in? And that through an email dialogue, a back and forth of maybe 3 or 4 emails, you could imagine how they would eventually resolve that conflict by agreeing to split the costs and having a surveyor come in and plot out the exact property line. So that would be very feasible to have email dialogues occurring. And so I won't go through examples for each of these, but you could certainly have negotiations, and I've done negotiations through email where I've hired trainers to do different training things for us and whatnot, and you do that through a series of back and forth emails. Okay, so that's the first one, email. The second one here is the phone, and again, it spans all the way through dialogue, through to investigations, and I don't want to press the point too much, but just as the way that the dialogue could have happened face-to-face, or the dialogue about the property line could happen through email, it's just conceivable that someone would have picked up the phone and said, "Hey, Bill, I'm worried about your proposed fence line. Let's talk about this." And so phone can certainly be used for dialogue, facilitation, and so on and so forth. And it goes all the way through to investigation and mediation. And I have indeed conducted a couple of mediations through the telephone or using the telephone. Presents some interesting challenges. You don't have some of the non-verbal communication stuff associated with it, like reading someone's face or their body language, but it is doable. Okay, the next one down here is Skype. Skype is, of course, the online video service, and again, that goes from dialogue through to investigations. Live chat goes from dialogue through to mediation. So you could see how maybe on a chat board, a moderator would act as a mediator between two members. And so I do this sometimes. Actually, I do a lot of online teaching, and sometimes two or more of the students will have a conflict that plays out online in the discussion boards, and through the chat boards or whatnot, I can act as a mediator and kind of help them to work out that conflict. So live chat goes as far as mediation, but it would not be applicable in a workplace investigation. Online forums, we see those as being applicable for dialogue, coaching, and negotiation. Twitter, here it's only on dialogue, and I don't know if with the small amount of characters you're allowed on Twitter, the quality of the dialogue, I would say, is quite questionable, but it would indeed be possible to have a conflict arise in the Twitter sphere and be resolved through Twitter. Lastly, here we have a webinar, which is basically a meeting of two people with their computers, and it would be possible to have dialogue through webinar. I've tried to do some of that before, and that can be difficult too. You can get people talking over top of one another, and if people have their microphones, all their microphones on, you get echo and distortion and all kinds of stuff. So I would say it can be a very limited tool in that regard, and that's probably why it's only listed here as affiliated with dialogue. So in all of these different modern communication technologies, if we look at the box on the right side, you can see that we can make distinctions between them as being synchronous versus asynchronous. So, and that's going to change the quality of the communication. So a phone call is very synchronous in the sense that, it's live. I say something, you listen, and you reply back right away. Whereas an asynchronous means that one message is put up and it might sit there or wait for a day or 3 days or 4 days, and the other person doesn't necessarily get it right away. It's not happening in real time. So maybe you've had this happen with an email. You can send an email and then it can sit for 2 or 3 days until someone replies. So the communication can be broken and can be patchy. This can be a bad thing in that if there's any momentum in the conversation, the momentum can be lost because you're sitting around waiting for someone to reply to an email. On the other hand, sometimes that could be a positive thing in the sense that, maybe to help cool a conversation down, you could see how two people on the phone, because it's happening live in real time, it would escalate really quickly and, it could spiral out of control. But with emails, you don't have to answer back right away because it's an asynchronous communication form. And so you could think about your email. You can maybe draft it. You can maybe save it in the drafts folder. You can maybe go out for a walk to cool down. And then you can maybe come back to that email an hour later and see if you still want to hit the send button or see if you need to tone down the language. And so because it's asynchronous and there's this pause between the back and forth of the communication, it can allow an opportunity for revising and saying exactly what you mean to say Whereas, in a phone call, you might get yourself caught up and say something and say, oh, I didn't mean to say that, and you can't really take it back. So that's another thing. That relates to private versus public. There's, of course, I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself here. So two-way versus one-way is another consideration. So certainly on some webinars, especially ones that are pre-recorded, this is very much a one-way communication. So indeed, this video lecture that we're looking at right now, where I'm explaining this conflict resolution spectrum, this is an asynchronous one-way communication. I'm recording this in the fall of 2016, and you might be watching this in the spring of 2017. So it's not happening live with you here on the session with me right now, and it's not two-way because there's no chance for you to raise your hand and ask a question. So this is a one-way communication where I'm presenting you with information, and hopefully you're taking it all in. Another dimension which these various different tools vary is along the private versus public. So there's a chance for your emails are private to a certain extent, in the sense that unless someone hacks your account, or you accidentally forward your email or you print it or something, generally your emails are private. There might be exceptions to that rule. Maybe I believe, if I recall correctly, one of the organizations where I worked had a policy that said basically my emails didn't really belong to me, they belonged to the organization, and if they needed to basically access my emails, and they would have access to all of them. So there's variations in that depending on where you work and whether it's a personal email or a work email, but generally, your emails are going to be a lot more private than, say, what you post on an online forum. That would be very public. And again, in terms of private versus public, you can delete emails to help keep them private. But once you post something on an online forum, unless you're the moderator, it's out there for the world to see. It's very public, and in some cases it can't be taken back. Okay, so individual versus group. Again, in an email, unless you're sending out an email blitz to like 50 people, it's usually more of a directed at an individual or 2 or 3 individuals. Whereas, online forum, again, I've used online forums for teaching, students with classes with like 45 students. So what you write in that forum, you're not directing it necessarily at one individual, but you're crafting your message for the group. And so online forums can be a very good way to have a conversation with a huge group. Whereas if I had 45 students and I wanted to hold a class with them, say on the telephone, I think that would be almost to the point of being ridiculous, because there'd be people talking over top of one another and so on and so forth. So just using a phone or using Skype or using live chat is probably not a good way if you're dealing with a group. And so to link this back to the tools up above, you have to consider these features here of these different online things and see whether they fit. So if you're doing a negotiation, and let's say it's a multi-party negotiation with like, say, 10 people, it's feasible that you might want to set up, to help that negotiation along, you might set up with 10 people, like a conference call, and that could be helpful. Or a group Skype session. Or you might set up an online forum for the negotiations where there's a record, of all of the main proposals and documents and all of that. So you're integrating in these technologies into the negotiation process, but keeping in mind kind of their strengths and weaknesses, whether they're private versus public, good for individuals versus groups, and so on and so forth. So the last consideration here is, for each of these online communication tools, we have to consider, that some of them are written text, So the written word is one kind of form of communication versus audio, and sometimes you can't record that audio, versus video. So some people I meet with love Skype because you can either do audio call on Skype, or you can do a video call and they say we want to see you face to face. But there's also a little chat board thing built into the Skype call where you can send some text messages and share web links. So it's a very handy tool. Skype is probably the only tool on here that I'm aware of that combines text with audio with video. So if you want to keep a written record of a meeting, let's say you're doing a mediation, and you want to have a written record of, you know, the exchanges and the proposals and the back and forth and who said what, then creating an email chain, you know, because it's all text based, would make a lot of sense. Now, you know, if your mediation occurred on a conference call, and so that's all entirely audio, there's no, unless someone's taking really, really good notes and typing up a memo, there's no written record of the back and forth and who said what and everything. So these are one other consideration when you're looking at these online tools and how to incorporate them into negotiation or coaching or facilitation. Consider whether it's text or audio or video or perhaps all three, such as through Skype. Okay, so that concludes my overview of the conflict resolution spectrum for the 21st century. Just a real quick recap here. We've got the spectrum from informal and voluntary on the left to formal and mandatory on the right. Plotted onto that spectrum, ranging from dialogue, which is very informal, all the way through to the litigation or adjudication, which is the most formal. We've got all of these different conflict resolution tools plotted somewhere on here from left to right. For each of these tools, we can see that, you know, negotiation can occur through email, negotiation could certainly occur through phone, negotiation can occur through Skype, and so on and so forth. So we've got corresponding electronic communication tools that line up with each of these different conflict resolution tools. And for each of these communication methods, we have to consider whether they're synchronous or asynchronous, two-way or one-way, private or public, individual or group, text versus audio versus video. So hopefully that's straightforward, and you can keep that in mind from this point onwards, that each of these tools has certain strengths and weaknesses, and we want to match up the best online communication tool for our needs. And so thank you for watching.